listener production. Hello, Sasha Barbagat with you. Welcome to The Briefing. If I say the word casino, you probably think big money, high profits and high stakes. But despite their very glitzy reputation, they are a business with costs and risks. And there's rumblings one of Australia's major casino networks is about to go bust.
In reality, their prospects are pretty grim, and it's unlikely that they're going to turn around their financial performance in the next month.
So how on earth does a casino go broke? That's coming up in the second half of this episode. First, though, we've got Chris Spyrou here with the headlines on Thursday, January 16.
Morning, Sash. Morning, everybody. In news just breaking as we record, Hamas and Israel have finally reached a ceasefire agreement. Here's Qatar's Prime Minister confirming the deal, which is set to take effect this Sunday.
The exact timing will be identified later. The phase 1 of the agreement will go on for 42 days, and it will include a ceasefire and the withdrawal of Israeli forces to the east away from populated areas. Israeli forces will then be positioned along the Gaza border, and which will allow for the swap of prisoners as well as the swap of remains and the return of the displaced people to their residences.
It is believed talks to end the fighting for good are yet to happen, with discussions to continue over the coming weeks.
While this deal will obviously spark celebrations across the world, we've already seen it in those cities, of course, you can't ignore the immense and tragic human toll of this 15-month conflict. 1,200 Israelis were killed in the October 7 attacks in 2023 and 250 hostages were taken. While more than 100 have been released, 94 more are still being held in Gaza, 60 are assumed to be living and 34 dead. While in Gaza, the death toll from Israel's attacks is now at over 46,000 people. Citizens, including women, children and the elderly, make up a huge portion of the dead. Millions of Palestinians are displaced or malnourished, while homes, businesses, schools and hospitals have been destroyed by airstrikes. Now, in terms of when we'll kind of get this official confirmation, like I said, we've been waiting kind of since we got in quite early this morning, Chris, but it looks like Israel's government's not going to vote on the deal until tomorrow their time. Benjamin Netanyahu's office as well has come out to say, oh no, a deal has not been reached. There are still final details that are being agreed to. But a ceasefire deal does have implications for his leadership, Chris, because one minister has threatened to quit if there is a ceasefire deal reached. They think that Hamas should have to surrender to Israel in order for them to say, okay, no more fighting. And if that does happen, if that minister does quit, it could threaten Netanyahu's hold on power. So he has political reasons to want to stall this as well. We have heard from US President-elect Donald Trump, who confirmed that a deal had been reached and that hostages would be, quote, released shortly. He also said that the epic ceasefire agreement could only have happened as a result of our historic victory in November.
Okay.
Yeah, so again, taking credit, we are yet to hear from Joe Biden, but he's apparently going to address the media shortly. So still a lot more to come from this story, but this is the closest we've come ever to seeing a full ceasefire agreement reached.
Back home now, former Labor leader Bill Shorten will be waving goodbye to politics 9 days ahead of schedule, giving the Prime Minister an opportunity to reshuffle his ministry before this year's federal election. The NDIS Minister will end his 17 years in politics on Monday before taking up the job of Vice-Chancellor at the University of Canberra next month. And Sash, wages at universities are things we discussed on the show last week. And for context, the last Vice-Chancellor at the Uni of Canberra was on $1,040,000 a year. So there are reports that Shorten has asked the uni to cut his pay less than $1 million because he said that's too much money for the job.
What a hero.
What a hero. But it is expected that it will be, well north of $500,000 a year. Look, returning to the politics of it all, it is understood his ministerial responsibilities will be split between 3 ministers, with Social Services Minister Amanda Rishworth expected to pick up the NDIS, Finance Minister Katie Gallagher picking up Centrelink, and Minister for Youth Anne Arley to become Junior Disability Minister.
So a little background on Shorten. He's held the inner Melbourne seat of Maribyrnong since 2007, and he did lead the Labor Party for 6 years and through 2 losing election campaigns, one in 2016, one in 2019, and he did step down from the leadership following the 2019 loss, and that is when we saw Anthony Albanese take the reins. Shorten first announced his retirement from politics back in September last year, and as to what happens to his seat, Queenslander Joe Brisky, who has lived in Melbourne's inner west for about 5 years, has been pre-selected as the Labor candidate to run, Chris.
Yeah, and sticking with federal politics, Sash, Health Minister Mark Butler has rejected a proposal by private health insurers to increase premiums ahead of their April 1 deadline. This is the second time he's knocked them back, the first being late last year when the proposed increases sat around 6%, which is nearly double the 2024 increases of 3.03%. Importantly, this is a ministerial head of power. They are to approve annual premium rises. And just generally, 55% of our population have some form of private health insurance. So this is something that impacts a lot of us.
Yeah.
The cost of health services last year rose by 4.8%, while overall inflation rose by 2.8%. And I'm telling you that because any rise above inflation really risks, this political problem, especially in an election year that's essentially going to be fought on cost of living.
Coles has announced it'll strip its shelves of kitchen knives nationwide after one of its employees was stabbed at a southeast Queensland store. The 63-year-old woman was knifed in the back on Monday in Ipswich, with the 13-year-old boy accused of attacking her allegedly taking the weapon from the shop's shelves. She is in hospital still but is stable.
In response, the supermarket has made the call to ban the sale of knives from all of its stores out of an abundance of caution. They could make the decision to bring them back, though, with a review set to look at the incident and how knives are sold in stores.
Yeah, now it's interesting this has happened in Queensland, Chris, because it has sparked questions of the new Premier, David Crisafulli, who you might remember campaigned very heavily on cracking down on youth crime. Now, he has faced questions in the wake of this attack because the attempted murder charge of this 13-year-old boy doesn't fall under tough new youth justice laws that David Crisafulli has already approved. Now, when he was asked about whether it was a loophole or a mistake that they fell through the cracks, this particular case, he's promised to make many more changes to the hardline youth justice laws that have already been enacted, which impose adult penalties on young people accused of certain serious offences and carries mandatory life sentences for young offenders who are convicted of murder. Now, for context, Queensland is among the only jurisdictions in the democratic world to impose adult penalties on children because under these new laws, extreme cases could see kids as young as 10 face mandatory life sentences. And the number of children under 14 in adult police watch houses in Queensland has risen 50% in 12 months.
And it's been another disappointing day at the Australian Open for our local hopes, with Ajla Tomljanović, Jordan Thompson and Thanasi Kokkinakis among those crashing out in the second round. Speaking after his exit, the 28-year-old lamented his latest injury, this time to his shoulder.
Put myself in a winning position. I didn't have enough to get over, so that's annoying. But, playing through the first one, playing through that one, I just know, even if I win at what cost, I know I'm going to be out for a while, I think. So, yeah, I'm pretty flat.
But it wasn't all bad. Alexander Vukic is through to round 3 in the men's singles after a nail-biting 5 sets, and we've had 2 wins in the men's doubles.
While today, Alex de Minaur will play his second-round match against American Tristan Boyer, and comeback queen Destiny Iava also takes to the court in round 2 action. Fellow Aussie Tristan Skulkate, meantime, has a very tough task ahead. He is playing defending champ Yannick Sinner. And in the doubles, the special Ks will be in action. Thanasi Kokkinakis and Nick Kyrgios hitting Melbourne Park for the first time since they won their title back in 2022. And they're taking on fellow Aussies Alexander Vukic and James Duckworth. So plenty of great Aussies still in action, but really sad about Kokkinakis. And, it's interesting that he's playing on in the doubles after saying, this is going to keep me out for a while. But I do feel like there's a different vibe to the doubles, especially the way the special Ks play. It's all about fun and being silly and kind of, I know it's a serious tournament, but I like seeing them jump around and have fun. So,
oh yeah, they're so exciting to watch. And especially with the injuries, this is something that Kyrgios said. It's, ruled him out of the singles, but, it's enough. There's enough there to get him through the doubles, which is so good and so good to watch.
All right, enjoy day 5. Chris, thank you. Next up, it is our deep dive, and we're looking at how a casino could possibly go broke.
That's a sound most of us would be familiar with. Whether you've ended up there at the end of the night, popped in for a cheeky slap on the pokies, stayed at their hotels, or eaten at one of their restaurants, casinos are well ingrained into Australian life. They're our little slice of Vegas, but they're also a place where billions of dollars are lost to gambling each and every year. It's no secret that Australia is the gambling capital of the world, with $32 billion lost on legal forms of gambling per annum. And while the house supposedly never loses, especially given its grip on hundreds of thousands of people addicted to gambling, how did we end up in a situation where our largest publicly traded casino operator is in serious financial trouble? Star Entertainment, who have operated casinos in Sydney, Brisbane and Gold Coast for decades, could be broke within weeks. Charles Livingstone is a gambling expert and associate professor at Monash University. Charles, how on earth does a casino go broke?
That's a good question. Mostly casinos go broke because they are reliant on sources of revenue that dry up. And in the case of the Australian casinos, which are the big chains, Crown and the Star, are both struggling at the moment because they have two big sources of revenue in recent years. Remembering that most of the money that comes into casinos comes from what the casinos charmingly refer to as the grind. That is ordinary people who put ordinary amounts of money, but often much more than they can afford, usually into their slot machines. So in Australia, that's, over half of the revenue, and that's typically, around that globally. But the two big Australian chains have been making quite a lot of money out of effectively money laundering and the exploitation of vulnerable people to an extraordinary degree. So the money laundering has come in the past from large, what they call whales, big spenders at casinos who are unfortunately often fronts for international criminal syndicates. And this has been particularly the case with some Chinese gamblers who have been representing the interests of Chinese triad gangs. And some of these people are the worst people in the world. They're engaged in all sorts of nefarious criminal activity. And unfortunately, a lot of their money has been laundered through Australian casinos over the years. And the second major source of revenue was the exploitation of vulnerable people. Now, both these chains of casinos have said that they have quote unquote responsible gambling policies in place, but these are much more honoured in the breach than in the observance. That is to say they've got responsible gambling policies. They don't actually enact those policies. So during, for example, the Royal Commission into Crown, we discovered that people were being encouraged to continue sitting at poker machines or at gaming tables for as long as 36 hours at a stretch without leaving them, literally, and were essentially being encouraged to continue to do so, that they were being encouraged to set really high limits where they had membership cards and so on, so they could gamble all day long without it hitting their limit. So when those two sources of revenue are disrupted, then the cream in the revenue mix disappears. And it's very hard for them, having built up the expectations of all this revenue and put in place all the expensive infrastructure to service it, that it's very hard for them to keep their heads above water. And that appears to be exactly what's happened, both with Crown, which has suffered probably less than the Star, but the Star is a really clear example that this party can't go on forever because they've run out of these lucrative sources of revenue.
The role and function of a casino and these casino operators extends beyond the actual place of the casino where people gamble and sink all their money and sometimes lose a lot of their money. How much money does a group like Star Entertainment need to survive, and what is that money being used for?
Okay, so they have ancillary businesses. They have accommodation businesses, hotels and so on. They have hospitality businesses, restaurants, bars, etc. But the bulk of their revenue comes from the gambling operation. So I think in 2023 annual report, Star had revenues of $1.8 billion and still made a fairly substantial loss. Last financial year, they made $1.7 billion and had an even larger financial loss. So to service their situation, to make sure that they've got enough money to cover the interest on loans and advances of money and lines of credit and so on, to pay all their workers, they probably need in excess of over $2 billion a year in the case of Star and maybe twice that in the case of Crown. In Australia, we spend $32 billion a year gambling. Most of that goes to poker machines and, another big chunk goes to online wagering and so on. The only sector in Australia that's actually gone backwards since the pandemic began is the casino business, which has lost 35% of its revenue over that period.
Why is that?
I think the real reason that the casinos are struggling is for the reasons I've just outlined, that they are no longer able to exploit vulnerable people to the extent that they did. And they have, their junket operations and their capacity to launder large sums of dubious money has now evaporated because the inquiries, royal commissions and so on have required them now to operate in accordance with the law, strangely, which previously they weren't really doing.
I'm curious to know, do you think there's a cost of living factor in all of this as well? Is that, a potential reason as to why our interest and people spending at casinos is down?
Yeah, that would be the case if everything in the gambling sector was down, but it's not. I mean, every other sector of the gambling industry has grown, wagering in particular, but also poker machines and all the other forms of gambling. So the only sector of the gambling industry where there has been a decline in revenue, so I'm measuring it from before the pandemic, 2018-19, until after all the pandemic restrictions were over, which is 22-23. So every other sector has grown quite dramatically, whereas the casino sector has declined quite dramatically, very dramatically, in fact. So I think what that demonstrates is that if there is a cost of living factor, it's limited to casinos, which seems unlikely.
This week, the narrative is that there's a really good chance that the Star's going to go broke and that they won't be able to effectively operate from mid-February. A lot of economists are predicting. How true do you think those predictions are?
Oh, I think they're very viable. I mean, one of the analysts says it's a toss of a coin, and I think that's probably about right. Towards the end of last year, Star had a crisis of liquidity and it couldn't finalise its accounts. So it couldn't publish its 2024 annual report until it had resolved its liquidity problems. And they did that with a $200 million line of credit from a consortium of banks. Now, they've burned through the first $100 million, and in order to release the second $100 million, they have to demonstrate that they've hit certain performance targets. Now, it appears that they're unlikely to hit those performance targets, which means they're effectively going to run out of money. Their share price is, I think, an all-time low, around 10 cents per share. It might have been bouncing around 10 cents at the moment. But in reality, their prospects are pretty grim. And it's unlikely that they're going to turn around their financial performance in the next month. So in those circumstances, what you would expect is that if they run out of money, they'll have to call in an administrator and go into either voluntary administration or be put into administration by one of the governments to which they owe money.
One of the lines of credit that have been completely ruled out is support from the New South Wales and Queensland government where Star operates. How have we seen government support play out in the past? And is this a change in tune from, Premier David Crisafulli and acting New South Wales Premier Penny Sharp, essentially saying that we're not going to help you guys out in this situation?
Well, the New South Wales government has already axed plans to increase the rate of casino tax at the request of Star, which said they couldn't afford it. That was a pretty substantial bailout when you consider how poorly behaved these businesses have been, particularly the Star, and how much venality they have demonstrated. I mean, it's not just, indifference to regulation. They were actively hostile towards regulation over a period of time. They've changed all their personnel now to overcome that. But at the end of the day, the business itself has been a very poor corporate citizen, you might say.
Mm.
So from the perspective of the government, you have to say, at some point, they have to say enough is enough. So they've already been helping them out a lot. The Queensland government has clearly been supportive of the Star and to a certain extent continues to be so. If you look at the massive building, the edifice which is rising from the banks of the Brisbane River, or has risen now, it's pretty clear that the state government has bent over backwards to provide them with support in getting that thing up and running. And indeed, the Queensland Premier has said he's not interested in the business, or rather in the company, he's interested in the workers. So that translates into, well, if you're interested in the workers, what are you going to do? Now, it may well be, there's a number of options, of course. So if it goes into administration, whether voluntarily or at the behest of one or other of the governments, then the administrator will obviously either try to trade out of their difficulties if they can secure credit to do that, or they can try and sell the business or bits of it in order to gain some liquidity and get back into the game. But the problem is, to get from where they are now to where they want to be will require some support from government, particularly if government is saying, well, we don't want anyone to lose their job. So that's not going to happen unless the state governments do something to assist. And that would probably mean perhaps some guarantees for credit, perhaps some guarantees for people's employment continuing, etc. So it's one of those dilemmas where you have a big business in the centre of town, which is supposed to be a peak tourism attraction, and suddenly it looks like a white elephant, and it is a white elephant. So what do you do about it? If you want it to stay there, you have to help sort out the mess that they've got themselves into.
In your opinion, do you think the government should be bailing out the Star?
No. I mean, this is a commercial business which has been antagonistic to regulation. It's made a lot of money out of essentially criminal activity. It defrauded the China Union credit card system of roughly $1 billion. God knows how much money laundering activity has gone through there. They're reserving a fine. They're reserving a sum of $150 million in the likelihood that the anti-money laundering prosecutions require them to fork out that amount. I mean, these are significant problems. And, if you or I were guilty of such crimes, I'm sure we would be inside for a very long time.
Yeah, and I guess to kind of play a little bit of devil's advocate, those in favour of casinos as institutions, they do say that they kind of are a staple of our nighttime economy across, a lot of Australia's major cities. Crown is a huge part of Melbourne's nightlife, as is the Star in Sydney, as it is in Brisbane and the Gold Coast. They're also a big source of employment. With the state of the economy at the moment, having mass joblessness would be a problem. And gambling ultimately is legal in Australia. What would you say to people who kind of come out to defend casinos on that basis?
Well, if they'd obeyed the law and done what they were required to do in terms of providing services responsibly, I would have fewer problems with a bailout. The problem is these companies have performed abominably. Now, the real problem is, how do you get out of this mess? I appreciate every point you've made. There's a lot of people working down there. They are not responsible for the mess by and large. They do contribute some vitality to the nightlife. I don't know how much they're contributing to Brisbane at the moment, but certainly in Sydney and Melbourne, they are distinct venues that people will attend and, in many cases have fun. Although the other side of this problem, of course, is that many people find their products highly addictive and end up in diabolical trouble, imposing enormous costs on them and their families and society generally. So don't discount that. But, my sense is that if you can operate a casino in accordance with the law and in pursuit of your obligations to provide your services in a very responsible and disciplined manner, fine. But if you can't do that, as neither Crown nor the Star have in the past, you should get out of the business. There are casinos around the world that make reasonable profits, but which operate according to quite severe restrictions on people's ability to lose all their money. In Switzerland, for God's sake, the home of privacy around money, if you spend too much time at the casino, you are required to produce evidence that you are spending it within your means and with your family's understanding and agreement. Switzerland.
What can we expect to see in the next couple of months? If you were operating the Star, what would you do?
Well, I wouldn't be in the first place, but if I were, I would be probably thinking about how I could develop a business model that did not rely on exploiting vulnerable people, which adhered to all the regulation and law that it's supposed to, and not only to the letter of the law, but to the spirit of the law. I would be considering whether I needed to scale the business back a bit, and I think that is undoubtedly the case. I would be asking governments to consider how best to support that transition. I would be arguing for a transition from this sort of mega style casino to a more boutique style casino, which does not rely on money laundering, which does not rely on exploiting the vulnerable, which can turn a reasonable profit, not the sort of super profits that Crown and so on have been making in the past, and which provide a genuine amenity to the city in which we live rather than rapaciously plundering its more vulnerable citizens of every penny they've got, which is what they've done.
Charles Livingstone, thanks for joining us on The Briefing.
You're very welcome.
That was Associate Professor Charles Livingstone speaking with me there. Thanks for listening to this episode of The Briefing. That's it for now. Before you go, though, we'd love it if you could share this episode with someone who you think might enjoy it. It's a really, really easy way you can support us and all that we do here at The Briefing. So we're sharing our social posts. Check us out on Instagram at The Briefing Podcast and on TikTok and YouTube. Just search Listener Newsroom. And don't forget, we'll be back in your feed with another deep dive from 3 p.m. But until then, I'm Chris Spyrou. Catch you next time.